for the first of two public information sessions about Article 8, which is the proposal, town facilities energy proposal. And my name is Linda Gray. I'm chair of the Energy Committee. The Energy Committee took an active role in moving this proposal forward, first to the Select Board and then through a working group and now onto the ballot for you folks to respond to. And my colleague from the Energy Committee, Aaron McCurdy, he's a very good numbers guy, and so he's worked the most on the presentation, and he's going to talk us through the various slides. And then we also have two folks from EEI, which is the energy performance consultant, energy performance contractor. They're our advisors on this project. So Mike Davey and James Harrington are here, and we can answer questions after the presentation. So Aaron, we'll start.
Or during.
Yeah, okay.
So so we're talking about this Article 8. I organized this slideshow into these three sections. Talk about where we're at, how we got to where we're at with the buildings and all that, how we got to this proposal and what the proposal is itself, sort of. So a year or so ago, or a little more, no, what do we have there, October? Oh, we started with this. So we all know we're in the midst of a climate crisis, that we have to do something about our carbon emissions. I think we're all on the same page about that. In October, the Select Board declared a climate emergency, as have many other towns in the state. Last year, a year ago, the town voted to eliminate fossil fuels from town operations. The language of the bill says something like 5% a year, which, if we count that from some baseline, would take 20 years, at least 5% a year. And Vermont has a comprehensive energy plan to get us to 90% renewable energy by 2050. And of course, this list could go on and on. So in terms of eliminating fossil fuel in town operations, meaning town buildings, town fleet, town with capital T, we have town fleet, which uses diesel and gasoline, fossil fuels. Town garage is heated primarily by propane. The safety building, the new safety building is electric, has mostly heat pumps for heating and cooling, but the old fire department apparatus bay still runs on #2 fuel oil. It's still heated by fuel oil. And then we have Tracy Hall, which is also heated with fuel oil. It's minimally cooled with electric, although I think that's 25 years old and isn't really used or particularly working well. Town fleet, we have police cruisers, which are gasoline. They are looking into hybrids for replacements, which would help some. The fire apparatus is diesel and gasoline, mostly diesel. Really aren't alternatives for fire engines at the moment. They're Rosenbauer's making an electric engine that they just sold one like months ago in LA to, I think, city of LA or Las Vegas, Los Angeles. That's not really probably an option for us right away anyway. The maintenance fleet is diesel and gasoline. I don't have a catalog of that, but there aren't really big trucks that I've heard of that are hybrid or all electric, although I'm sure that's coming. There are smaller trucks, and particularly passenger trucks, coming onto the market in the next few years. So we can certainly look at that. Biodiesel is a possibility. We were doing that for a few years ago. I'm told that we stopped doing that partly because supply in New England is really difficult, unreliable. So about 70% of the town's carbon emissions, that municipalities' carbon emissions, come from this fossil fuel. The fossil fuel emissions come from the fleet, at a cost of something like $60,000 a year. Town garage is, as I said, heated with propane. It's a pretty new system. It's a radiant system that uses as overhead propane to really just for comfort, to heat people rapidly. It's not really designed exactly as a space heater, and that's because you open and close the doors all the time. the air goes in and out, but you've got this radiant heat immediately to get people comfortable again. That's not a system that's easy to replace with something electric or renewable. It's not particularly amenable, and it's a pretty new system, so it's appropriate to the building. So we, as we were talking about it, we didn't feel that that was really a low-hanging fruit kind of target. It's about 10% of the town's emissions. It's not a very old system, and about $6,500 a year in propane costs, on average, a 7-year average. Safety building, apparatus bay. It has the old furnace from before the new building was built, which is not a new system, but it's not ancient. It's oil, as I said, it's oil. It uses hot water, overhead blowers, circulating hot water, and because the building isn't used that much, it's not like open and closed daily, it doesn't really use that much energy, $3,000 a year, about 5% of carbon emissions. There are other things that we should do to the apparatus bay probably that are lower hanging fruit, like replacing the doors that aren't particularly big doors that aren't particularly well insulated, insulating the walls. Already did the ceiling, or the roof, I think. So again, this heating system in this building is not a particularly, someday, if we're going to do our 20-year fossil fuel replacement, it will need to be replaced, but it isn't particularly high priority. And then we get to Tracy Hall, which is heated with oil, has a at least 25-year-old oil system, which is probably nearing the end of its life. About 15% of carbon emissions for the town come from just Tracy Hall. That's mostly oil, and about $20,000 a year for that oil. See what else have I got there. We did do a blower door test. Didn't do particularly well. As we were talking about this, EEI pointed out that the building is not up to current code. It's grandfathered for not having active central ventilation and cooling. If we were to do anything but just replace the oil boilers, we will need to install ventilation and cooling. It already has a little cooling, but it's not up to code. So the project just got twice as big as soon as we realized that. And since the agenda of the whole thing is to get rid of fossil fuels, we're going to have to, basically going to have to tackle that problem. Here's our fossil fuel use in a couple of data ways. I have a graph on the bar graph on the upper left, just showing basically, if the big image weren't tilted a little to the left, you'd see that line is just slightly going up over the last 10 years, 10, 12 years. So we're on average using a little bit more, or emitting a little bit more carbon every year. The breakdown on the right is the percentages. So like I said, about 70% for the fleet, 15% for Tracy Hall, 5% for the apparatus bay, and 10% for the town garage. This chart on the bottom shows it's sort of essentially the same thing. It has the costs, 18,000, like I said, for Tracy Hall, and the amount of equivalent amount of tons of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere. As you can see, the fleet is the largest chunk, but Tracy Hall's next by quite a bit. So the process of how we got to the proposal that we're putting forward. March 2018. So 2 years ago, we began working with Efficiency Vermont to update an audit that we had of Tracy Hall and think about how to possibly do what they call a deep energy retrofit. A deep energy retrofit, Efficiency Vermont will give you up to $160,000 for a commercial building, which this is classed as, and if you can get to around 50% energy reduction. At the time, we didn't think that was really feasible for Tracy Hall with the kind of project, what kind of money we were talking about, or the kind of project we had. And then we got a feasibility study, only a feasibility study, not even it wouldn't even have come up with an actual plan, but just a feasibility study from an outfit in Massachusetts for $20,000, which we did not do. It seemed we didn't have $20,000 for one thing, and it didn't seem like necessarily the way we wanted to go. Then in March 2019, town voted to reduce fossil fuel use by 5% a year, as we said, and our focus kind of shifted to maybe we do have a bigger project here if this is the right way to go about it. So working with the town manager issued an RFQ, request for qualifications, for an energy performance contractor to examine potentially the whole town operation and think about this 5% a year, how we're going to go about reducing energy, fossil fuel use. In August of 2019, we selected EEI, who does develop the proposal that we're going to talk about, and at no cost to the town, because that's the way they operate. And then when we started to talk to them, we realized that we really wanted to talk about fossil fuel elimination, so we asked them to make that their focus of their proposal. So what's a performance contract? I had to learn this. This wasn't obvious. I didn't know this. So the difference between a standard, the way we think about a contractor, where you go to them, you tell them what you want to do, they say how much that's going to cost. You can get bids from many contractors because you already know what you want to do. That is not what this is. A performance contract is different. In that standard way of thinking, where you do a request for what do we call RFP, request for proposals. So you say, I want to do this. How are you going to go? How would you go about it? You get a bunch of them from a bunch of people, and with different numbers on it. Performance contract is a structure set up, as I understand it, at least in the state of Vermont, for municipalities and schools who don't have the expertise to say they know what they want to do, to look for a company that will give them suggestions about what they want to do, and pricing and all of that. But the flip side is you don't then go to multiple companies with that idea, because you've gone to one company and said, how should I do this? So what you do is you put out a request for qualifications to find a company that you want to work with. And then once you've done that, you've essentially chosen the company, and now you together with them come up with the project and execute it. So in this case, we chose EEI. They did an energy audit. And then in the standard performance contract, they will then become the single point of responsibility for that project. And if anything goes wrong, they are responsible for that. And furthermore, they actually guarantee the energy savings that they project. Literally guarantee, as in if they spend more than that, there's a structure for the town to be compensated for that, for failure to make the projections. A distinction that I learned about is the difference between a performance contract, like I said, where you project some savings and then you guarantee those, and what they call an investment grade audit, which would be things that don't necessarily have a guaranteed savings, where you're making maybe a change to a building. For example, in Tracy Hall, ventilation would be an investment grade change, where we're not expecting a certain return from that. That's a new thing that didn't have before. So it's not exactly the same thing. In this case, the town asked EEI if it would be possible to, instead of doing the standard performance contract thing where they do the work and they guarantee the savings, instead to bid out all the subcontracts. Well, in that case, it's we're now got into a kind of a hybrid. So we're in some sort of a hybrid now, between the performance contract, as in, because we did a request for qualifications, we started that process, but now the town has asked EEI to essentially become a general contractor and bid out all the subcontracts.
What are the potential subcontracts?
Subcontracts for, well, we haven't done all the parts yet, but there will be ventilation, there will be LED lighting changes. There's a new electrical instance required because of more electricity. Since we're switching from oil to electricity, there's going to be more required. That sort of thing. I don't have a full list of subcontracts or anything like that yet. So for the Department of Public Works in the Apparatus Bay, we considered various things. One way to heat those buildings that might be effective would be to make the radiant slabs, but that requires cutting out the existing slabs, pouring a new one. We considered digital controls, LED lighting upgrades, and of course envelope improvements, weatherization basically. We decided that the existing heating systems for those two buildings are appropriate, even though they use fossil fuels. They can be maybe addressed later with other options. And the buildings are both recently renovated to some degree, and systems are not at the end of the life. So we concluded that what's in the proposal now, as we will get to it, is LED lighting and digital controls for those two buildings. Tracy Hall, however, as I said, any scenario other than a grandfathered replacement of the oil boilers, we have to upgrade the envelope and ventilation system and add AC to the building. So we considered some possibilities. One would be simply to replace the oil-fired system, and I've got some sort of pros and cons here that I already mentioned some of. So obviously oil is fossil fuel. It won't really improve efficiency of the building to continue to use oil. We will have to have an oil system in the building for 30 years unless we want to throw it away early. It is relatively cheap to do on the first, low first cost. Propane has a couple, is similar to oil, maybe a little bit more efficient. One issue with propane is there's not any obvious place to put a propane tank with all its offsets between the parking lot and the road on both sides and the size of the site. Again, we're tied to a fossil fuel for 30 years with propane. Again, it's relatively cheap up front, maybe a little more than oil, but a little more efficient. We talked about a wood pellet system. It's not strictly speaking, a fossil fuel. It is a combustion fuel, so that's not ideal, I think. Again, like the propane tank, there's not really any obvious place to put a silo for pellets. It's the same problem. You probably have to take some parking places, or if you're going to do it on the exterior, or take away some office space on the interior. Wood pellet system is arguably higher maintenance than other systems, and again, we're tied to that particular fuel for 30 years, and it has a relatively high first cost, not maybe the highest on our list, but higher than probably propane or oil. And it has a fuel cost, same as do propane and oil. Then our last two, D and E here, are two different heat pump scenarios. An air-to-air heat pump system. That's kind of what's in there. What you see now on the outside of the building, these compressors along the side, those are mini split compressors. That's an air-to-air heat pump system. So it would be something like that, but centralized with ventilation and to go with all the other elements. So the disadvantages, I would say, of an air-to-air heat pump, it's a relatively expensive system, maybe a little cheaper than our last option, but not much. The exterior units remain or become larger. There may be more of them. Air-to-air heat pumps are not particularly high performing and at extreme temperatures, because after all, in the summer, you're trying to dump your heat into the hottest possible air. In the winter, you're trying to draw heat from the coldest possible air. So it's not the most efficient. First cost is a little less than our last option, and similar to the others. But it does have a low annual cost because it is relatively efficient energy-wise compared to combustion systems. Our last option, which is what we're ultimately proposing, is ground source heat pumps. A ground source heat pump does the same thing an air-to-air heat pump does, except it moves the heat into the ground in the summer. So if you have excess heat in the building, you dump it into the ground through a system of wells using water, circulating this water. It's a closed system. And then in the summer, you draw that heat. How did I say that? You dump your heat into the ground in the summer. In the winter, you draw that heat back out of the ground to dump into the building. This is probably the most efficient system that I think exists today, because you're reusing some of your heat, and in the extreme temperatures of the summer and winter, you're using the ground temperature for your base. So you don't have to. You're not trying to dump You're not trying to dump heat into hot air and draw heat from cold air. You're always doing that to a ground temperature of almost always something around 50 degrees. So advantage of that, there will be nothing visible from the outside. Those compressors would go away. The ground source system is all under the parking lot, wouldn't be visible. Totally silent, just per circulation of water underground. It's the most efficient system. It's a good use of the site, by which I mean nothing visible from the outside, and no noise or or exhaust for that matter. It's a very low maintenance system because all you're doing basically is circulating water outside of the building. And it is reliable in cold, well, extreme temperatures. It's a little bit more expensive to build, and then it has by far the lowest annual cost because it's the most efficient. And it's so over a life cycle, it is arguably the cheapest.
And
Yeah.
with all those packages except A, you had mentioned that if you should do anything other than replace the oil boiler, you're going to have to do the upgraded, or not, the new ventilation system. So all those B, C, D, and E.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think some people would say, I haven't asked the question, I don't know if we've asked the question specifically the state, could we grandfather in a propane system? I've been told that we couldn't. I don't know the answer to that for sure.
But the wood pellet area.
Definitely. And then the other thing is, as I understand it, if we just tighten up the envelope of the building, if we insulate the attic, put new door sweeps on, do stuff like that, now we've changed the ventilation of the building, and we don't have ventilation, we're probably, if we ask the question properly, do we require ventilation? You do, because the building would be too tight for not to ventilate.
Do those vent systems have additional air handling equipment associated with those?
Oh yeah. So yeah, if you put in a propane boiler and ventilation, now you also have to buy air conditioners and all the ventilation equipment. So it's not, so you get, all the ventilation stuff is the same with each system. Essentially, not identical, but it's similar. A similar amount of stuff that you need to ventilate the building with all of these options. What's different really is how you heat. And because heat pumps both heat and cool, you actually have less stuff with a heat pump. Because you don't need a heating system and a cooling system and a ventilation system. You have one ventilation system with the heating and cooling built into it. That's using a heat pump. So it's a sort of simpler system. But the upfront equipment is, propane. Everybody has propane boilers. Everybody makes propane boilers. They're dime a dozen. They're easy to buy. Heat pumps are a little bit fancier, a little bit newer, and they're a little more expensive. I think I'm characterizing that roughly right. So this is just what I call a values checklist. So it's just what are the a bunch of things we care about, and which of the systems meet that criteria. So most efficient is ground source heat pumps, going from left to right. No combustion, I think, is something that is, especially in the middle of the village, it would be a good thing. So the heat pumps are not combustion. Zero fossil fuels, arguably pellet boilers are also zero fossil fuel, since trees aren't actually fossil. But zero carbon emissions is only the heat pumps. Lowest first cost, and I'll get to that table of costs in a minute, but air-to-air heat pumps actually have the lowest first cost by the estimates that I've got. Lowest annual cost would be the ground source because it's the most efficient. Lowest life cycle cost, I think, still comes out to air-to-air heat pumps, although we did some new numbers, we ran some new simulations, and it might actually be that ground source comes out cheaper because it's cheaper annual. Its annual cost is lower, and over life cycle, which is 30 years, that adds up.
How much?
How much what?
How much cheaper?
I'll get to that table. I have a table. We'll cover that in a minute. So just finishing this table, high CO2 avoided per dollar. So in other words, for how much CO2 do we not put into the atmosphere per dollar we're spending now? The two heat pump systems are by far because they don't emit any carbon, of course. Even though they're a little more expensive, they avoid so much more carbon that they're the best on that measure. Least site impact, I would argue, is ground source. Don't lose parking spaces. We will lose parking spaces for a pellet silo or a propane tank, probably. So those two don't get that check mark. And so 8 out of however many there are, I guess 10, for ground source heat pumps, and 7 for air source. So Tracy Hall, this addition of adding building ventilation to Tracy Hall, more comfortable and code compliant building, the ventilation system itself doesn't care what heating. We could build a ventilation system for whatever heating system, so those two things aren't exactly tied together. It would be heat recovery ventilation system, so some large fraction of the heat that was going out, of the air that was going out, the heat would be recaptured and put into the air coming in. It is these systems do cost money. It's an expensive retrofit to Tracy Hall. There was talk about doing a whole district, like downtown district geothermal system. Instead of just doing Tracy Hall, what if we took, say, the green, drilled a whole bunch of wells in the green, used that heat source and cooling source to distribute heat and cooling to the entire downtown area. Offered it to the churches, offered it to the school, offered it to the residences downtown. So that was talked about a little bit at least one select board meeting. Actually, there's an old proposal, I don't know whatever happened with it, from maybe 2008, that's something similar. So this is just a little pros and cons on that. It would be very cool, unique, community-based opportunity. Likely it would be somewhat more efficient, although you're distributing this heat, so that all depends on the details. Obviously, this would be a bigger project that would take a long time. So you'd have to get into regulation. You would have to be expensive to build. It's not ideal necessarily for everybody. This room, for example, is used very infrequently, so spending a lot of money to heat and cool it doesn't necessarily make sense. The school is not used in the summer, so cooling it isn't really a big benefit, things like that. And of course, you have to now have staff maintenance for billing, metering, administration, maintenance. And what that would do for fossil fuel use for the town is something that would have to be estimated in some large process. Because obviously the Tracy Hall would be able to use that system, and the apparatus bay, if we built a system like that, but the town garage wouldn't. And then of course there's all the effects of all the other buildings that were to use it, such as maybe the school and the churches and all that. So that's a whole different scale of project. That is not what we are proposing, but it was talked about, so we threw it in here. So just a background slide. I already really talked about this, how ground source heat pumps work. It basically is going to use electricity to circulate heat out of the ground in the winter and into the ground in the summer. The way I think about it, it's kind of like your building becomes a reverse refrigerator from a heating perspective. You cool the outside to heat the inside, and then in the summer it becomes a refrigerator. You cool the inside and heat the outside. And heat pumps are something like 4 times as efficient a way to heat with electricity as traditional electric heating, like we think of, baseboard radiant or baseboard electric heaters, which just basically essentially burn the electricity as fuel. It flips the economics of electric heating, because if you do the math, which I've done a couple of times now, how much energy is in a gallon of oil? It's something like 40 kilowatt hours equivalent to about 41 kilowatt hours of electricity. Well, that gallon of oil costs $2 and something cents. That 40 kilowatt hours of electricity costs like $6 or $8 or something like that. With the 4 times multiplier, it's cheaper to use electricity to heat your building than the gallon of oil. Without the 4 times multiplier, it's cheaper to heat with oil. So basically, that efficiency gain of heat pumps makes electric heating cheaper than fossil fuels. Then you add, probably over the next 20 30 years, some sort of pricing for carbon and increases in the cost of fossil fuels for that reason, or any carbon-based fuel, and your economics are going to change further. But right now, today, this is a cheaper way to heat than fossil fuels, which is not, I think, obvious to everyone. But it's also super reliable, especially a ground source, because you're just circulating water. You don't have anything, you're not circulating any coolant, volatile coolant fluids or have any of that kind of plumbing. It's just water plumbing, which we know how to do and we know how to make very stable. Has a long life. All this underground stuff, no reason it shouldn't last 50 years if no one digs it up by accident. Works very well, as I said before, in colder climates. In this case, what's being projected is 16 wells that would go under the parking lot. They're maybe 400 feet deep or something like that. They would have to be drilled, and then they would be plumbed and then they would be paved over, and we'd have a new parking lot, and they would then, then they'd just be there with all their plumbing and would never need to be, they'd be circulating water through them, but they don't need to be actively worked on again after that. Repaving of the lot, and it's totally visually and auditorily invisible. So here's our cost table. There's been a lot of versions of this table. This one starts with the status quo. These numbers are taken from the 2017-2018 heating year. I should explain, there's a few things to explain here. The annual expense is not just the cost of the fuel. I stuck in there a little bit for maintenance, just because the systems are a little different in that way. And then I stuck in there, more importantly, I stuck in there an estimate of the price of carbon. So what they call the social cost of carbon. I did that for two reasons. One, because I think it's disingenuous to pretend that we can dump carbon into the atmosphere without a price, without a cost to it. And two, because very likely we are precisely at the end of the era when we're not pricing carbon. Sometime in the next minimum 5 years, there's going to be some sort of way in which carbon is priced, and we don't just pretend that we're not dumping this stuff into the atmosphere like it was an endless reservoir. So I think that adding a price to carbon makes this table more realistic. The price I used came from a study that Stanford did that came up with a number, $220 a ton. You can come up with any number you want. Anybody can search the internet for these things and come up with a number anywhere from 50 to much higher. It's just a matter of picking one. I thought the Stanford study seemed reasonable. So that's in the annual expense. Naturally, that makes ground source heat pumps the cheapest on an annual basis because they're the most efficient, use the least energy, and don't have any carbon. So the price of heat of all of the entire energy system for Tracy Hall, with ventilation, cooling, heating, and lighting and computers and everything else, as best we can estimate it, is something similar to what it would be now. So it would not cost more per year to run Tracy Hall than it does now. And we would gain all those other the benefits of ventilation and cooling. And I was just thinking of one other fact about that. Oh, and it's on a later slide, but the net change in total energy would be something like a 60% reduction. So it would be the actual energy in terms of equivalent BTUs or kilowatt hours or whatever unit you want to use would be about 4/10 with ground source heat pumps. So there's a couple more columns here. Annual tons emitted, obviously very low for heat pumps. The only reason there's anything in there is because you have to attribute some carbon to the electricity being used. In Vermont is the cleanest electricity in the country, and we have a power purchase agreement with a solar field in Heartland, I think. So you could argue that that's almost zero. It's even with Vermont's average a carbon per kilowatt hour value, it's almost zero, 1% of what we're using now. First cost of the project is basically it's everything that we think that the project's going to take. So the lighting, the ventilation, the heating, carpentry, new electrical entrance, all of that kind of stuff, with some estimates, because we don't actually have a detailed, fully costed out quote for propane and oil and wood pellets. But those are reasonable back of the envelope kind of estimates. By these numbers, I think the cheapest, well, I've got two of them that are about the same. So oil and air-to-air heat pumps are very similar. 30-year life cycle cost. Life cycle cost just means the first cost plus 30 times the annual cost. Pretty simple. I didn't worry about the interest on the bond. Yes, there's interest on the bond, but that's true for all of them. We'd have to borrow the money for all of them, so it just left that off. So this life cycle cost is just, as I said, first cost plus 30 times the annual cost. By that, the air-to-air heat pumps come out cheapest because in this table, because they're significantly cheaper, $200,000 cheaper to build, And the annual difference between ground source and air-to-air heat pumps in terms of efficiency is only a couple $1,000s a year. So over 30 years, that's not enough to overcome the difference in first cost. However, the life cycle kilograms of CO2 avoided per dollar is highest, should be highest for ground source. Something came out wrong in that. I just made some edits to this table, and obviously I got them a little wrong. But it should be highest for ground source. It's not very similar anyway. And personally, I think the ground source, it's very hard to get this kind of thing into the table, but the advantages of the ground source in terms of not having equipment outside that you can see and hear that can get hit by a truck, and having the buried stuff that is essentially zero maintenance and will last for 50 years. As I said, it's hard to get that into this table, but I think that's really significant. So I personally believe the ground source is
If we're talking about putting all that in the parking lot
Yep.
there, which it sounds like, do we know where Tracy Hall's septic system is? And
Tracy Hall doesn't have a septic system as such. Tracy Hall has a tank.
where, do we know where that tank is?
We know where the tank is. The tank fills up and then gets pumped out. Doesn't, so
And do you know what kind of soils we have as we go down?
we have essentially, barring something geologically bizarre, we have essentially the same kind of soils that Dartmouth has been drilling in for their tests.
I live on Main Street, okay? I live on that side of Main Street. We have beautiful sand.
Yeah.
Across the street from me, like St. Barnabas, when they had to redo their septic, I understand they're clay. So it can,
Yeah, but we're going 400 feet.
Yeah, way deeper.
400 feet, so it's really not relevant what's on this. Basically what I mean by Dartmouth is Dartmouth has been doing some testing of drilling deep wells for ground source heat, and they're drilling in very similar material, the bottom of Lake Hitchcock, and their number. So I think, if I understand it correctly, we've been using their test numbers for estimating how this will work. So in fact, this is not a totally blind guess that soil will work.
I think when they did the Norwich Square, they found they hit the water table pretty quickly.
It doesn't matter. This is a sealed system, so we're going to drill these holes and then basically use these drilled holes as a heat exchanger. So the water that's circulated, we won't be circulating groundwater, and we won't be dumping.
Line the hole so the groundwater.
Yeah, the groundwater is completely isolated. So this just circulates and just dumps. It literally just dumps heat. And so really, what matters is the heat transfer qualities of 400 feet of well, and those, as I said, Dartmouth has estimated those recently, conveniently for us, and it's suitable. So, do we need exactly 16 wells? Great.
So we're going to lose that parking lot, though.
No. Well, for a little while, yeah. For a few months. For a few months. But the advantage is that we'll get it back.
Aaron,
New pavement.
Yeah.
Another thing, just to clarify
Yeah.
there on so you have the first cost with the oil only, 240, and then you jump up, and that is because you're ventilating now, you're adding all this infrastructure.
Okay, yeah, so the very first line is don't do anything, right? Status quo. Sometime in the next 5 or 10 years, the system will fail and we'll have to replace it. So we're currently emitting something like 45 tons of CO2 a year, and that's our baseline for the whole table. It still costs us $1 million to run it over.
sure, I'm just saying, there's just a big gap between.
Yeah. So
240
I'll go. The next one says replace the boiler only. We're allowed to grandfather that.
Right.
So that's only $250,000, $40,000. Still costs us $1 million over 30 years because of the fuel cost and the cost of carbon. So next we jump up to if we do anything else other than replace the boilers, we have to ventilate. So now that costs another $1 million.
That's what my question was.
Yes.
What is that ventilation infrastructure piece that seems to be consistent?
Yes,
through your system?
yes, that's exactly right.
What is that?
So that's heat recovery, ventilation in the attic.
In dollars,
$1 million.
$1 million, okay.
Roughly. Yeah, I mean,
So your next.
each of those, if you fully cost out each of those scenarios, the actual equipment that you'd buy would be different. If you buy air conditioners under one circumstance, you use the heat pumps for cooling under another circumstance. You buy a propane packaged HVAC unit to put in the attic in propane, but it would be an oil one and it would be a hot water one if you were doing pellets. So the actual equipment is different in each scenario. I've used because I don't have numbers for each of those scenarios, they're separate, like costed out actual estimates for those. I just used the numbers from, basically from the heat pump audit that EEI gave us, and I said, okay, what part of this is for ventilation? I'm going to say that's the same. It's not going to literally be the same equipment if we did it with propane, but we're going to need more things if we do it with propane that are different from the things. So just the best number I had.
It would seem, you know, well, isn't there anything between 240 and 1.5? But knowing that there's that ventilation aspect in it,
right.
That's what's not
right.
quite clear in that.
Yeah, there isn't anything between. I did run a bunch of scenarios pretending that we could do something in between. Like, could we put in propane or could we put in pellets and not put in ventilation? But the fact is, and I have a table of those somewhere, and but we can't do that. It's not actually. So I decided it didn't make sense to present options that we don't have.
And there's a bigger mission here than.
Yeah, well, and then there's also the mission, right?
Wanted.
Yes.
People that,
Does the heat pump do all the heating all the time, or do you need supplemental?
Particularly with air-to-air heat pumps, you need some supplemental, because when it's super cold out, you not only are you're losing a lot of heat out of your building because it's cold, you are less efficient because you're trying to get heat out of very cold air. With ground source heat pumps, you need less supplemental. In these scenarios, the supplemental is resistive electric. So you turn on basically a little bit of inefficient electric heat built into is that right?
Into the equipment.
Built into the ventilation system, and just boost it when you need it. Because it's digitally controlled, we won't be doing that unless the building's actually occupied. So in the middle of the winter, at night, very cold, you're not going to need to probably turn on the boost because you're not really actually needing to heat the building. So I did this exact same project but without ventilation in my mother's house. My mother's house, we insulated her house, and immediately as they were doing the insulation, the oil boiler failed, so it rusted through. So now it's November, so quickly got someone to come and put in a central ducted heat pump. So it's really kind of comparable to this project on a very small scale. There's 15 kilowatt resistive element in there. I've looked at the heat use from the electric use from Green Mountain Power. Even when it goes down below zero, the total use for the day only goes up a little bit. So I don't even not think that thing's necessarily coming on. It's certainly not like suddenly huge amount of power. And it's wonderful. The heat is quiet, and it circulates at the fan is at different speed. It doesn't just blast the building with a lot of heat. It works.
Who's your power purchase agreement with again? I didn't quite get it in. Will that be sufficient to cover?
Linda knows this.
The town currently has a solar power purchase agreement with Solaflect. If this were to pass, we would seek to do another because Solaflect has a limited field of community solar. And so I think we would end up doing it with a different solar developer, but we could do that. The town has multiple meters, so we could definitely do it. We're not going to investigate that until this proposal passes.
You don't have, for example, a KW estimate for that.
A what?
Oh, how much?
How many kilowatts? Approximately?
It's approximately covering the entire town's use at the moment, I believe. Is it, or mostly?
It was designed to originally. We've had a little bit of increase in electricity production from the car chargers and things like that.
Oh, so you
Probably slightly,
so we're a little less.
Slightly below 100% of.
So would this mean that there would be an additional PPA, and if so, for a guess of how much KW for that?
Okay, so the whole system, all three buildings, we'll get to this, at the last estimate that we figured out this morning, is going to use something like 40% less energy. But all of that is going to be electric. Whereas currently it's 5,000 gallons of oil and 1,000 gallons of propane. So I think it's not going to be a huge increase. Like, for example, Tracy Hall currently uses 72,000 kilowatt hours a year of electricity to run the heating system, lights, and everything else. With ventilation and cooling and no more oil, it's going to use something like 120, maybe 100, maybe 150. So it's an increase. You could call that double. But we're gonna put in LED lighting, efficient lighting, and digital controls at the town garage and the apparatus bay, which will save, I think the number's in here, but it's saved maybe 35,000 kilowatt hours a year. So it might be something like 65, 70,000 kilowatt hours more a year for the 3 buildings. But obviously no oil and propane, and less propane. Yeah.
How efficient is the existing one?
80 something. It's 19 circa 1994. It's 80 something percent.
80 something
That's what I'm told. No, I doubt it's been tested.
No, yes, it has.
Okay, 80.
I think it was 81.5.
81 and a half.
And have you looked into doing this thing in basically in phases, such as going after the ventilation and the insulation, tightening up the building, Tracy Hall, and leaving the existing oil furnace in, oil boiler in there?
Yeah, so going to geothermal is if geothermal is what the town selects, doing that in a phased manner is pretty difficult because the equipment is going to be designed to run off. So right now the building is heated using 180 degree water. The heat pumps operate at a much lower operating equipment. So it's hard to just do little pieces of this if we're going to geothermal. If you were to do the first option and put in a new oil boiler or a new propane boiler, you could phase that for sure. The other thing is, I know one of the things we talked about early on was, should we do the low-hanging fruit first, like insulate the attic and do the lights and the new thermostats? The problem with the insulating the attic is if you were to go in there and insulate the attic prior to putting the ductwork in, it would make putting central ventilation almost impossible. So you really want to put in the new ductwork, get the building laid out for the new ductwork first, and then do your insulation with the new ductwork layout to accommodate access to the equipment.
The ductwork is actually that wouldn't be the same ductwork used for any particular.
Yes, it would. Yeah, so I mean, it would be the ductwork would be the same, but you'd want to do that before the insulation. Yes.
Again, the question was that you could, if the ductwork would be the same and the insulation would be the same on it, this thing could be, you could go after some low-hanging fruit. I'm not sure exactly what where we're going with this thing. The cost is significant.
Yeah, the cost is significant. I don't. There's a lot to be gained by doing it all at once. For example, the current heating system has some sort of ventilated cabinet heaters in the basement. Well, those, if you put in a ventilation system, but try to retain the current heating system, now you're not controlling the heat because it doesn't really suitable to be controlled. Those cabinet heaters aren't suitable to be controlled by the digital control system. But you've got, it's just going to make sort of an unholy hybrid for a while. It really is, the right way to do it is to do it all at once.
Well, have you looked into it, though, is what I'm getting at.
Well, I think we don't have like costed out scenarios for that now.
So you want focus, basically.
Well, remember, part of our mission, the mission of the Energy Committee here is to replace fossil fuels. So we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about how can we keep the oil furnace that's 25 years old.
So, yeah, I mean, I think part of it as well is that each of these pieces is pretty significant in itself, expense-wise. So, the ductwork, the ventilation system is itself something that we've got we've borrowed money usually over 20 years. So it's not like you can pay for something and then go to the next step. So I think that's part of the reason why it makes sense to do it together, because you can't pay for it as you go. You're going to be paying for all of it over like 20 years.
Right, and there's significant efficienci's to doing it all at once.
That's just all cost. It's just,
yeah, that's a whole new.
To make a better workspace, but it is cost. So, I mean, if we're going to do the just cost bit, let's do the benefit bit with it.
Right. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to go back to the very beginning, but
sure.
I'm curious, when EEI was looking at this, you said that the town's fleet is 70% of our fossil fuel use. Why are we looking at that first, and what can we do with $2 million the fleet? I know you said that you...
I would love to have options for the fleet, but I don't think we have them. However, I think that they will come over the course of the next 20 years. So in 10 or 15 years, maybe you can get a heavy truck that's hybrid or that's actually electric. You know, the technology is moving very fast in transportation, and we just are not at the point where we have a good option. I mean, I'd happily spend $2 million on diesel trucks if that was a practical thing to buy right now. But there's a very good option for Tracy Hall that's very tested and exists now and is not going to get necessarily a lot better over the next 20 years, and that's heat pumps.
It's also, I think, that most people will tell you that you don't want to retire something early just to make it greener, that's ultimately a waste of resources. So our fuel pump needs to be replaced. So there was a big thought that, golly, we would really like to not make a 30-year investment in another fossil fuel facility. Similarly, our police fleet is in need of rollover. So this last year we voted for replacing one of our police cruisers, and we did opt to do a hybrid for that, which was a little bit more money because that technology is available, and it's something that needs to be replaced. It's the time in the cycle where we want to replace that. Luckily, we're not at a place where we have to replace our heavy trucks. We're getting pretty close on a fire truck, but not quite yet. So hopefully that technology will catch up with it. They actually have a snowplow made in 2008. It was all electric, and then they stopped making it because it was a little ahead of its time. So that technology is definitely there.
Yeah, I mean, they could make them. People are making heavy long-haul trucks that are electric. So it's just it's really kind of just a matter of time for transportation, but it's not a matter of time for heating. Heating is here. So,
is there any way to replace the fossil fuel use in Tracy Hall, get rid of it without doing the ventilation system? And I don't know what the code.
Yeah, you can have a cold building.
But what if the offices are moved to a different area? Or,
different building. There's
yeah.
no.
And what's the code say for use of a building to upgrade the ventilation system?
The code is bigger than this building, so I don't really. I tried to delve into the code and I couldn't find like a handy little sentence that said these are the circumstances under which you require ventilation. It's a commercial building. If you built it now, it would have to have ventilation. We're grandfathered because we didn't build it now, but if we change it more than a certain amount, then it's like we built it now. We have to have ventilation. That's my understanding of it. It's obviously much more complicated. There's magic in the code. You'd have to solicit, you have to solicit an opinion and get a committee together to answer any of these questions. But my understanding is basically we changed much about the heating system or the building's energy structure, and we have to ventilate.
Do I understand that if we brought it up to code, we would have a building where we don't anymore open the windows in the middle of the winter to cool the space that we're
yeah.
And it would be a building where during a heat wave such as we had year before last, people who work in that building would have a more comfortable working environment.
Yeah, well, that's another whole thing. Yes.
And that those would last forever, long past the time when this is...
Well, 40, 50 years. Yeah. That's not forever. Yeah, no, I think that's another piece of this is we are asking our town employees to work in this building, and it is it's been up to sort of the standard, and it is no longer up to standard because the standard has moved on, and we're at the point where the systems are at the end of their life. It's time to do some upgrades. This is what we have to do. The fact that we also want to eliminate fossil fuels makes it look like this is a fossil fuel project. Actually, as it turns out, it started with the Energy Committee thinking about energy efficiency, but in fact, it's sort of gone around, and it's in fact now just an infrastructure project. The Tracy Hall needs a new heating system. If you replace the heating system, you have to ventilate, and that's the code, and that's for good reason, and so that's what we have to do. It's not a lot cheaper to try and do it some other way, and that's part of what this table is about. If you put in a new oil boiler at $240,000 and a ventilation system and air conditioning, you're still going to spend 1.5 million instead of 1.7 million. So there's maybe a couple $100,000 more to put in to eliminate our fossil fuel use and make the building super efficient. That to me is easy. It's an easy decision, but and then there's another piece which are not reflected in these numbers, which I was just suddenly realized this morning. When we started this whole thing, we started talking about deep energy retrofits and efficiency Vermont. We didn't think we had the momentum for that project. Now we do. If we do this project, it will reduce the total energy consumption in Tracy Hall by something like 60%. We should be able to get, and we haven't had a chance yet to ask Efficiency Vermont about this, we should be able to get $160,000 back from Efficiency Vermont for a deep energy retrofit. If that's the case, EdArace is almost the complete difference. And this system that's now going to save us 60% on our energy use and be all electric and be no fossil fuels and no combustion and the lowest maintenance and the most efficient and upgrade the building to meet code is also going to be essentially the same cost as if we were to do something 20th century. So it's a pretty, I think it's a pretty easy, actually, a pretty easy decision if you're ready, if you understand, if you're ready to do the infrastructure needful on Tracy Hall. Other questions?
Timeline to up and running.
End of next summer. If we pass it in March, by the end of the year anyway, I think by the end of the summer, it could be completely done.
Summer 2021.
2020.
2020. Oh, it's not.
Mm-hmm. Not a big project for these guys. In terms of, it depends, I'm sure, a little bit on, how things go and what they find and that kind of stuff. But my understanding is the goal would be to be done with it by the end of this summer. So I have a few more slides. I think we probably basically covered it all. So we basically talked through the proposal.
Let's move this forward so it's
the sunlight?
There's not that much more.
Other way. Chris has been good at
Just, don't fall. Okay. So, as I've said, Apparatus Bay and Department of Public Works will get the digital be included in the digital control system, which would be an online system, and also centralized control of the buildings. They'll get LED, efficient LED lighting, and cost would be something like $133,000 for those two buildings, save 32,000 kilowatt hours a year, and some propane because they will. The digital control system will make the heating more efficient as well. Something like $7,000 a year in savings, and at least some additional maintenance reduction from the efficient lighting. Tracy Hall will get ventilation, ground source heating and air conditioning, LED lighting, digital controls, weatherization. We'll throw away the oil stuff, oil tank and boilers. Cost is $1.7 million. I've put net of projected rebates. That was before I thought about the deep energy retrofit. So that would actually be, that was with the $50,000 estimate. We're now talking with the deep energy, it would be something more on the order of $180,000. So we're down to somewhere around 1.6. Projected 57% reduction in energy use just for Tracy Hall, 41% reduction for all three combined. Here's the article, you've probably seen it. Shall the voters of the town of Norwich authorize issuance of not more than $2.055 million with possible reduction through receipt of federal, state, and other grant funds, and so on. Yeah, for HVAC control lighting systems in Tracy Hall and lighting and control systems in public safety and apparatus bay, apparatus bay, and public works. How it be financed is really we have a bunch of quotes. It doesn't really the warrant article doesn't actually specify. Could do a bond, could get us just straight up loan. There's at least a couple other possibilities, including the possibility of leveraging some I think federal tax benefits that the town can't use through a agreement with a private party who would benefit from the tax benefits, and the town would get a discount. So that's a possibility that's being looked into. that would again decrease the initial cost, and it would not decrease the initial cost for other systems. It would only decrease the initial cost for heat pump systems, since heat pumps would get the federal tax rates, as I understand it. Tax impact. So if you have a household income less than $47,000 a year, there will be no impact because of the state tax rebate. If you're over $47,000, the increase would be something like, assuming the full amount, something like 1.68 cents per $100, which comes out on this table. So for a $200,000 house, it's $34 a year. For a, usually we talk about a $400,000 house, that'd be $67 a year. And for, you know, $3 million, it would be $500 a year. And I think that's it. So any more questions?
Do we know any peer towns that have already done this kind of thing?
I don't think that we know of a town hall in Vermont that has done this. I actually think this is a great opportunity for Norwich to be a leader in this area. And the other towns, I know Hartford is talking about a performance contract. I think that we could really show the way a little bit, and I think that's one of the exciting things about it. But
So is your question about geothermal, or is your question about?
Yeah, well, had other people successfully implemented this
So-
kind of technology?
Oh, yes.
Is it proven and?
Yep.
oh yeah, well, heat pumps are very proven. Ground source heat pumps a little less common because they're a little more costly up front. So residentially, people will usually just go with the air, as did I. But new construction in particular, where you have the opportunity, you've already dug everything up, you've already got ground sources.
So just Mike Davey again with the so I will say, you mentioned 2008 as a date, or someone did, about when electric vehicles were being used more and more, and then they stopped producing them. What was interesting is during that time period, and we're talking the 1990s to the early 2010. I personally was involved in 4 major geothermal projects that were all, we did one with Bowdoin College, we did one for the New Hampshire State Liquor Store in Nashua, so if you're ever down that way, that's a geothermal building, a bunch of office buildings. And James, our engineer here, was doing these systems all over the Midwest, geothermal. They started to fall out of favor a little bit in the 2008, 2009 region, when the fracking started to really pick up. And what happened was fossil fuel prices came down, and so people were less and less willing to spend that extra 100 to 200,000 to drill wells in a commercial building when natural gas prices were sub $1 a therm and propane was at $1.15 per gallon. So the technology works great. All the geothermal buildings we've been involved in, the comfort's great, but that fracking is really what pushed the geothermal market back. We are starting to see it come up. We're working with Cheshire County and over in the Keene, New Hampshire area to really expand their geothermal offerings now that more and more our customers are putting a price on that climate. We're not just looking at, okay, propane's cheap, let's burn it. They're actually saying there's more of a cost to just what you pay per gallon.
Other questions? All right, well, I think we have a fact.
Yes, I think most people have.
Okay.
There's one sheet of paper. Many of you who arrived early, you have the frequently asked questions. There is as well, if you go to the town website, their homepage has a link to other materials that have been collected on a single web page. So, and this slideshow will be there. It isn't there yet, but it will be. I'm trying to think. We're doing a rerun of this, and so there'll be presumably a different group of people and perhaps other questions. But that's Thursday night at the library, so 6:30 on Thursday. So come again if you would like and see if there's a different roster of questions, and then we will also be around at the town meeting discussion on Monday, the 2nd of March. I'm not doing this whole thing because we don't have time to do that, but that's another opportunity to ask questions.
Can I ask one more question? I'm sorry, but I'm just curious. I got something on the listserv that talked about all the other budget items that the town is facing right now. I don't know if it's true or not, and, you know, I don't know if I haven't followed it, but I'm just curious if the town has a capital improvement plan and how this might fit in, and, you know, so that we can anticipate costs that are coming up, because this is a big jump.
I would look to maybe select board member to comment on that. One thing to realize is that the town has a select board that oversees town with capital T operations, and then there's the school board which oversees schools. So there are two separate bodies that make those decisions. We are all the same taxpayers for those decisions, so there is no one single unified thing for Norwich taxpayers in terms of capital things. There's two different bodies that oversee that. John, do you have any further comment? Or?
Yeah, so that's right, and so the school is totally separate, so they're dealing with the septic thing, but all of the things they're looking for are, again, at least 30-year plan. So yes, it will be an expensive thing to totally redo a septic system for an entire school, but that will then be paid for again over decades. We also have, so each of our departments in our town has a capital plan for big expenditures like big snowplows or fire trucks or things like that. The town manager has also been working in the last year to update the general capital plan for the town. It has also included things like roads, culverts, bridges, things like that. The road infrastructure has suffered a little bit over the last probably 10 years, a little bit of less planning. So he's been working on doing that. So there definitely is that focus and increasing in that.
Is that it? Thank you all. Oh, John.
Just say one of the things that doesn't come out. You look at I guess the first, what did you call it, first year cost? First cost of these things, and those can jump off the page, and you know, you get this vision of a bill that the town has to pay at any given time. It's sort of like John says, we just have to really understand that the real numbers to look at in general are what really happens over time, and the delta between those, and then the effect of that on the taxpayers, because we're never going to get a bill for $1.7 million. Yes, we owe that money over time, but it's really important, I think, to remember that what we're looking at is, even if we just keep what we have and we try to keep it going, there's a really big cost of it. Whether you're for it or against it, I just hope that it's not because of that first cost, which, you know, is the very first thing on that's the first number on the column, which can be, even if you're against it, you don't want to look at that. Even if you're against this project altogether, you don't want to look at that as the reason to be scared of this. You've really got to look at the whole picture, which can be hard to do when you see a 0, 240, and then 1.7. That just, you know, our brains don't.
Yeah.
Mine doesn't. I mean, I look at that, it jumps off the page.
What I think about it, you've got a septic field here, you've got a failing heating system here. What do you do in your house when you have a failing heating system and a septic system in the same year? Well, you know, you do the best you can. We're going to limp along with the septic system for another year or two, and we're going to, the idea is to replace the heating system because it's going to be cold. So, it's end of life. So the problem is, the risk is that if we don't do something about it and it does fail, or you shut the building for the rest of the winter, or you figure something out.
Life in that case, I think, sure, I think on it. But what I'm saying is that how much of the maintenance has it gone through? I mean, generally speaking, you know, has the service tech?
Oh, it's regularly. It's got a tag on it. It's being serviced every year. It's
understandable, but have they said to you? Have they said no? This has X amount of time, or is it just because that it's 25 years old? It's time to change it. Because we can talk about there's many things that you get into a point where it's 20, 25 years, 30 years old, or so, and saying, hey, it's end of life, but it still is working. It functions.
We could keep using that oil blower probably for another decade or two, but we would be continuing to burn 5,000 or more gallons of oil every year, which is something that the town has said they don't want to do.
Again, I just want to make sure that we're not, you're saying, we're talking about a failing septic system right now, as far as I understand it, for the school. Now you mentioned that this is a failing system at Tracy Hall.
Yep.
This is projected because of the age, not necessarily that it's failing like a septic system.
Correct.
So
Yes, that is true.
There's two separate things on it, what I'm getting at. That's two entirely separate animals there.
Fair enough.
But in that case, if I had, in your example, I would be putting off replacing my boiler or furnace boiler heating system and taking care of the septic system because that's failing. And I'd be projecting this out for the next year or two, something of that nature thing, and fixing a few other things here and there on. That's how I run my budget at home. So
well,
go ahead. Sorry.
Sure. Fair enough. Anything else?
I just want to add one more thing. When on the listserv, when these numbers are coming out, I think it would be a good idea if you wanted to pass to include that it includes the ventilation system, because that's not coming out clear, at least
That's
to me.
because the Energy Committee, or I certainly, have not engaged on the list. Because what I tend to find, this is my experience, it's like fueling a fire. Engage on the list. Doesn't matter how accurate you are, doesn't matter how clear you are, it just churns up more misinformation. I would say that in terms of, that's exactly right. Stuff that's been going around on the list is really missing some of the fundamental points of this whole project. And it's just missing it. It's like.
But even from you guys, like even from the Energy Committee, because you just say we're going to do geothermal, and of course that's like the gold standard, and everyone thinks.
Well, our listserv posts have been targeting people to these information sessions. We have not, as Aaron points out, that nobody on the Energy Committee has specifically responded and tried to describe this project. We've just been saying, hey, we have a web page with a lot of information collected on it, and we've got information sessions. So we've been trying to get people to pay attention to this, and we'll be posting this stuff so that people can see that. If you have a different understanding now, and you would like to post on the listserv, you're welcome to engage. But
I would just reiterate the point that I think I just heard made, that the take-home lesson when I first heard this presentation by the contractors at the select board, as well as at this session, is that this is much more than replacing the fossil fuel system of Tracy Hall. It's bringing us a Tracy Hall that's up to standard and doing it in a way where we don't have to make a decision in a crisis moment that would lock us into something. And that is something that comes through these information sessions, and it's well worth the effort that you're making to get people out of these information sessions so that they can hear this presentation. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, I think it's valuable feedback to that because we sort of did come at it from the energy side and then realized that we were really talking about an infrastructure project. I think it's valuable that we point that out to say that so people haven't necessarily heard that. I think we had a question back there.
I didn't really want to say anything today, but you did a good job there. And I do this 4 times a week with customers.
Oh, well, why were you up here?
Because I get tired of it. I came here because I didn't want my taxes to go up. I was hoping we could wait in the town hall. And I was irritated by the attitude that we would all jump on board with this as we're cutting our carbon footprint, and some of us are in trouble for taxes. And I think we always forget, it came from the select board meetings, that the town survey said reduce the carbon footprint, and also said keep taxes where they are or lower them. That gets forgotten. Interesting, I think what could help the town a lot is that, and this happens to me all the time, when we have a failing septic system and we have a failing heat system in a house we're trying to renovate, just like this gentleman in front of me said, we're horrified at numbers. We're horrified at the septic quote that comes in, we're horrified at the heating quote. Then when we look at the cost over time or how much it would cost to wait, as John was alluding to, having those numbers really helps the town. I would guess if we were to wait, I 5 years from now, I mean, I can't imagine this is gonna, dollars gonna shrink, this economy's not gonna last. So that's something to keep in mind. And I just think having those numbers, when we start looking at in terms of, where mortgage rates are at on residential work, it's like, it doesn't make any sense to wait sometimes. As painful as it is, and I don't want my taxes to go up, I'd like to figure out some other way to improve this, so we could, and also your point about whatever we do for heating system is gonna be, it's gonna be hot air, and that ductwork system. And when I heard this, when I first started hearing about this, I said, insulate the attic immediately. But your point about, it was foolish because you're just gonna disrupt the ductwork, is a great point. And so, I just think hearing about the money and the bond issue and the rates would be really helpful.
Also, as far as I know, the the school board hasn't said what they're going to do about the septic system yet. So we're not actually ready to compare that. And people are throwing around big numbers, but I haven't seen. I mean, we haven't made a decision. They haven't made a decision, so we don't really know what that's going to be. Anything else? Anything else? So please, post good information on the list. Tell everyone to come to the next session.
Thank you.